Two cops asked a simple woman to leave her son's medal ceremony. Not because she caused trouble, but because her shoes didn't shine, and her coat had seen better decades. She didn't shout. She didn't resist. She simply stood there, holding something in her hand. And within minutes the room shifted. Conversation stopped. Champagne paused mid-sip. And the men in the back row, let's just say they weren't just guests. And they certainly weren't amused. What was she carrying? Why did a ballroom full of polished strangers suddenly forget how to blink? The answer says more about honor than any speech. Take a guess in the comments. You might be closer to the truth than they were. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center buzzed with polished conversations and the soft clink of champagne glasses. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over men in expensive suits and women draped in designer dresses, all gathered for the annual military honor ceremony. The atmosphere was one of refined celebration, where the city's elite came to honor heroes while basking in their own generosity. But as the afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, a figure appeared at the entrance that didn't belong to this world of wealth and privilege. Gerald Mason stood at the doorway, her weathered hands gripping a crumpled envelope. At 45, she looked older than her years, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from working 3 jobs just to make ends meet. She wore a faded blue coat that had seen too many winters and black shoes that had walked too many miles. In her trembling fingers, she clutched a small photograph of a young man in military uniform, his smile bright and hopeful. The contrast between her humble appearance and the opulent surroundings was stark, drawing stares and whispered comments from the well-dressed crowd. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you're in the wrong place," came a stern voice from behind her. Officer Kane, a young policeman hired for security, approached with his partner Officer Brooks, close behind. Kane was 28, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from believing he knew exactly who belonged where in the world. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his attitude dismissive as he looked Cheryl up and down. "This is a private event for invited guests only. You'll need to leave." Cheryl's grip tightened on the envelope. "I have an invitation," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient chatter. My son is receiving an honor today." She held out the crumpled paper with shaking hands, but Kane barely glanced at it before shaking his head with a condescending smile. "Ma'am, I'm sure you think you do, but this doesn't look legitimate," Kane said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "These ceremonies are for military families, and frankly, you don't look like you belong here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave peacefully." His partner Brooks nodded in agreement, positioning himself to block any potential escape route. From across the room, Tyler Blackwood noticed the commotion. The 40-year-old businessman had contributed significantly to the event, his construction company's logo prominently displayed on banners throughout the venue. Dressed in an Armani suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, Tyler had the kind of confidence that came from wealth and influence. He strode over with purpose, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Officers, what seems to be the problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and approved of their actions. "Sir, we're just removing someone who wandered in by mistake," Kane explained, his chest puffing with pride at having the attention of such an important man. "She claims to have an invitation, but clearly there's been some confusion." Tyler's eyes swept over Cheryl's appearance with barely concealed disdain, taking in her worn clothing and nervous demeanor. "I see," Tyler said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that others followed without question. "Well, we can't have just anyone disrupting such an important ceremony. The families here have sacrificed enough without having to deal with this." He gestured vaguely at Cheryl, as if she were an unpleasant stain on an otherwise perfect day. Cheryl's hands began to shake more violently, but her voice grew stronger. "I am the mother of a hero," she said, looking directly at Tyler despite the intimidation in his gaze. My son, Jake Mason, died fighting for this country, and I have every right to be here when he receives his honor." The words came out in a rush, desperate and fierce, but they only seemed to amuse the men surrounding her. Kane let out a short laugh, the sound sharp and cruel in the elegant space. "Lady, I think you've been watching too many movies. Military families don't look like, well, like you." He reached for the envelope in her hands, his patience clearly at an end. "Let me see this so-called invitation?" Before Cheryl could protest, Kane snatched the paper from her grasp. Without even opening it, he tore it in half, the sound of ripping paper cutting through the ambient noise like a gunshot. The pieces fluttered to the floor, and with them seemed to fall the last of Cheryl's composure. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to collect the torn fragments, while tears began to stream down her weathered cheeks. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking as she tried to piece together the destroyed invitation. "That was all I had left of him. Please, you don't understand." But Kane wasn't finished with his display of authority. He pulled the photograph from her other hand and held it up mockingly. "This? Your son?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like every other soldier to me. Probably picked this up at a thrift store." Without warning, he dropped the photograph and brought his polished boot down on it, the glass frame cracking under the pressure. The sound was like a physical blow to Cheryl, who let out a sob of anguish that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the spectacle but maintaining their distance as if poverty might be contagious. Some looked uncomfortable, but none stepped forward to intervene. This was Tyler's event, and he was clearly in control of the situation. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "Remove her from the premises immediately." Kane reached down and grabbed Cheryl's arm, preparing to physically escort her from the building. But as his hand made contact with her shoulder, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. From the back row of chairs where 8 men in dark suits had been sitting quietly throughout the ceremony came the sound of chairs being pushed back. The men rose as one, their movements synchronized and purposeful, creating a presence that seemed to fill the entire space. "I suggest you take your hands off her," came a voice from the back, cold and steady as winter steel. The words carried across the room with military precision, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Kane's confidence wavered. His hand froze on Cheryl's shoulder as if he'd been burned. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm doing my job here." Before Kane could finish his protests, Captain Reed cut him off with military precision. "Mrs. Mason has more right to be here than anyone else in this room," Captain Reed replied, his words cutting through Kane's protestations like a blade. He moved to stand beside Cheryl, who was still on her knees, trying to gather the pieces of her torn invitation, her hands shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. Tyler Blackwood stepped forward, his face flushed with anger at having his authority challenged. "Captain Reed, I appreciate your service, but I can't have someone disrupting the dignity of this ceremony." His tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that others followed without question. Used to having his financial contributions buy him influence, the crowd murmured with surprise, some beginning to shift uncomfortably as they realized they might have witnessed something far more serious than a simple security issue. Tyler's confidence began to crack as he processed the implications of Captain Reed's words. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Jake Mason," Cheryl's voice suddenly rang out across the room, clear and strong, despite her tears. She struggled to her feet, clutching the broken photograph of her son against her chest. "My son's name is Jake Mason, and he died serving this country." The name seemed to hang in the air, and several guests exchanged glances of recognition. Some pulled out phones, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Captain Reed placed a protective hand on Cheryl's shoulder, his gesture both comforting and clearly territorial. Mrs. Mason was specifically invited to witness her son receive the honor he earned with his life. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Anyone who thinks she doesn't belong here doesn't understand what real sacrifice looks like. Tyler's face was growing redder with each word, his carefully controlled facade beginning to crumble. The other guests were beginning to whisper among themselves, some beginning to look at Tyler with suspicion rather than respect. Kane and Brooks exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly unsure of their ground as the dynamic shifted rapidly. "Prepare for a special honor ceremony," Captain Reed said, turning to address the event staff who had been watching the confrontation with growing concern. His voice carried the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question, and the staff members found themselves nodding automatically. "We'll need the full honor guard formation immediately." Tyler's face went pale as he began to understand that Captain Reed wasn't just making empty threats. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely, from celebratory to tense with anticipation. "You can't be serious," Tyler said, his voice now containing a note of desperation. "I've invested thousands of dollars in this event." Captain Reed's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you take your seat and prepare to learn something about real honor, because what you're about to witness will change everything you think you know about sacrifice and service." He gestured to the 7 men who had been waiting in the back row, and they began to move forward with purposeful strides, creating an atmosphere of impending revelation that left Tyler staring in growing horror as he realized the situation was spiraling completely out of his control. The silence in the room was deafening as Captain Reed's words hung in the air. Tyler Blackwood stood frozen, his mind racing to process what was happening, while Officer Kane and Brooks remained uncertain, their earlier confidence completely shattered. The other guests had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their expensive champagne forgotten as they witnessed something that was clearly much more significant than a simple security incident. Captain Reed's expression grew solemn as he turned to address not just Cheryl, but the entire gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to share something with you about Jake Mason, the young man whose mother you've just witnessed being humiliated." His voice carried the weight of someone who had delivered too many notifications to too many families, and the room instinctively hushed to hear what he had to say. "Jake Mason died 6 months ago in Afghanistan," Captain Reed began, his words precise and measured. "He was 24 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army, and he gave his life in service to this country. His mother, Mrs. Cheryl Mason, has been waiting for this day to see her son receive the recognition he earned through his ultimate sacrifice." The words hit the room like physical blows, and several gasped audibly. Tyler's face contorted with disbelief. "That's impossible. You're telling me that this woman is the mother of some soldier?" He gestured dismissively at Cheryl's worn clothing and tired appearance, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. The crowd around them was beginning to shift, some moving closer to hear every word, while others stepped back in discomfort. Cheryl's eyes flashed with a fire that had been building throughout the entire confrontation. "You think dignity comes from expensive clothes?" she asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You think sacrifice is measured by the size of your bank account?" She stepped forward, no longer cowering, but standing tall. Despite her modest height, the entire room fell silent, captivated by the transformation of this woman who had been dismissed as insignificant just moments ago. "I worked 3 jobs to put my son through school," Cheryl continued, her voice now carrying across the entire ballroom. "I sold my house so he could have the uniform he needed. I gave up everything so he could serve his country with honor." The raw emotion in her voice created a palpable tension that seemed to electrify the air. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, beginning to realize they had witnessed something shameful. My son Jake Mason died serving this country. Cheryl's voice rang out with such power that it seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers above them. The declaration hung in the air like a physical presence, and suddenly the atmosphere in the room began to shift in a way that no one had expected. From the third row, an elderly woman wearing a military service jacket slowly rose to her feet. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her posture carried the dignity of someone who had lived through decades of military life. "I am the mother of a veteran," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. "If what you've just said is true, then I apologize for not standing up sooner." Her words created a ripple effect throughout the crowd, and other guests began to look around uncertainly. A black man in his 50s, seated in the row beside her, leaned forward and whispered, but his words were audible to those nearby. "I was stationed in Kandahar. The name Jake Mason. I remember now." His recognition sparked something in the room, and several other guests began to pull out their phones, some discreetly searching for information, others looking as if they were beginning to recall something important. A young couple near the back of the room stepped backward, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding drama, but the woman gripped her husband's arm tightly. "He's real," she whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "This isn't some scam. Look at her face. Look at those Marines." The ripple of understanding began to spread through the crowd like a wave, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Cheryl was no longer standing alone. This subtle shift in the room's energy was palpable as people began to realize they might have witnessed something truly shameful. Tyler opened his mouth, but Captain Reed cut him off. The room waited in suspended silence as Cheryl took another step forward, her modest height somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. "My son died saving other people's children. He died protecting soldiers who got to come home to their families." She pointed directly at Tyler, her finger trembling with controlled rage. "Mr. Blackwood," Captain Reed said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "He died performing an act of such extraordinary courage that it will be remembered and honored for generations." The formal tone of his announcement created an atmosphere of solemnity that seemed to transform the very air in the room. Tyler looked around desperately, suddenly realizing that he had stepped into something far beyond his understanding or control. The police officers had backed away, their earlier authority completely evaporated. The other guests were staring at Tyler with a mixture of horror and disgust, finally understanding that they had witnessed something truly shameful. The carefully orchestrated social event he had sponsored was becoming something entirely different. But Tyler had made a fatal mistake. His earlier words had been heard not just by the society guests and the overwhelmed police officers, but by the 7 men who had been moving steadily forward from the back row. They had heard every word, every insult, every casual dismissal of a fallen comrade, and their faces showed a cold determination that was far more dangerous than any shouting. "Mr. Blackwood, you have just made the worst mistake of your life," Captain Reed said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more menacing than any shout. "You see, those 7 men walking toward us, they're Marines, and Jake Mason saved every one of their lives." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to physically move through the crowd, and Tyler's face went white as he finally understood the true magnitude of what was about to unfold. The 7 Marines formed a semicircle around Captain Reed and Cheryl, their presence transforming the atmosphere of the room from one of hyper-society-tivity to something much more primal. The elegant ballroom into something resembling a military formation. Each man stood at attention, their civilian suits unable to hide the bearing and discipline that had been ingrained through years of service. The lead Marine, a man in his early 30s with a scar running along his left jawline, stepped forward and addressed the room with a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words clear and measured, "my name is Sergeant First Class Martinez, and these are my brothers. 6 months ago, we were part of a convoy that came under attack in the mountains of Afghanistan. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a valley with no cover and no way out. By all rights, we should have died that day." His eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces of people who had never been closer to combat than a movie theater. Martinez's voice took on a different quality as he continued, his eyes growing distant as he relived that terrible day. "We were pinned down in a narrow canyon, bullets cutting through the air inches above our heads. The sound was deafening. Not just the gunfire, but the sound of rock chips, flying metal striking stone, and the desperate breathing of 12 men who knew they were about to die. The room was so quiet that his words seemed to echo off the walls, creating a visceral sense at the battlefield that made several guests unconsciously lean forward. "Each of us was making our last phone calls home," Martinez continued, his voice becoming more intense, "saying goodbye to wives, children, parents. But Jake was silent. He just sat there checking his M4 rifle, his jaw set in this determined way that we all knew meant he was thinking. Then, suddenly, without warning, he looked up at all of us and said, 'I'm going to draw their fire. You guys get ready to move when I do.'" The Marine's voice cracked slightly, and he had to pause to compose himself. Before any of us could argue, before we could stop him, Jake vaulted over the boulder we were hiding behind. He started shouting, firing his weapon, making himself the biggest target possible. We could hear the enemy fire shifting toward him, hear the bullets striking the rocks around where he was moving. But that's when our door opened. That's when we had our chance to escape. Martinez's hands were shaking as he spoke, and the emotional weight of his testimony seemed to fill the entire room with a sense of sacred witness. Captain Reed stepped forward, his dress uniform catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. "What Sergeant Martinez is telling you is that Jake Mason single-handedly saved 12 lives that day. He could have stayed in cover, could have waited for backup, could have made the safe choice. Instead, he chose to run into enemy fire, drawing their attention away from his trapped comrades and giving them the chance to escape. The room was so quiet that the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning system." Tyler's face had gone from red to pale, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. 12 lives, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The implications were beginning to sink in, and he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room focused on him with growing contempt. "Jake Mason will be receiving the Medal of Honor today," Captain Reed announced, his words carrying the weight of ultimate recognition. "The highest decoration our nation can bestow upon a service member. It's awarded only for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." The announcement seemed to reverberate through the room, and several guests audibly gasped at the magnitude of what they were hearing. One of the younger Marines stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Ma'am, your son saved my life. I was trapped under a burning vehicle, and Jake ran through enemy fire to pull me out. I have a wife and a baby daughter because of your son. They'll never know Jake, but they'll grow up knowing they owe their father's life to a true hero." Another Marine spoke up, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "Jake carried me 2 miles to safety after I was shot. He wouldn't leave me behind even though staying with me put him at risk." The other Marines, one by one, added their stories, each a different version of the same truth. Jake had saved them all. The accumulated weight of their testimonies created an atmosphere of reverence that seemed to sanctify the entire room. Captain Reed reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and wear. "This is Jake's final letter home," he said, carefully unfolding the document. He wrote it the night before the mission, knowing that he might not return. He handed the letter to Cheryl with the reverence of someone passing along a sacred relic. Cheryl's hands shook as she read the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting through her tears. "Dear Mom," she read aloud, her voice breaking with the accumulated emotion of months of grief and pride. "He was just my little boy," she whispered, her voice breaking with the accumulated emotion of months of grief and pride. "He was just my Jake, who wanted to help people." She opened the box with reverent care, and the metal caught the light from the chandeliers, its blue ribbon and star-shaped medallion seeming to glow with inner fire. The master of ceremonies, who had been standing frozen at his podium throughout the entire confrontation, finally managed to step forward. He lifted his microphone, clearly intending to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. But when he opened his mouth to speak, no words came. His voice caught in his throat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had witnessed. He lowered his microphone, his eyes filled with tears, and simply stepped back into silence. From the front row, a retired general in full dress uniform slowly rose to his feet. Without saying a word, he removed his cap and held it over his heart, his silver hair catching the light as he bowed his head in respect. The gesture was so profound, so completely sincere, that it seemed to ripple through the entire room like a wave of understanding. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Mummy, I want to meet Mr. Jake." Her innocent words broke through the formal solemnity of the moment, reminding everyone present that heroism lived on in the hearts of the next generation. As if moved by a single spirit, the entire auditorium began to rise. No one gave an order. No one made an announcement. Person after person stood up, creating a wave of respect that moved from the front of the room to the back. The applause that followed was different from any social gathering. It was slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like the beating of a collective heart honoring a fallen hero. The crowd of society guests watched in complete silence, many of them beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more important than any social event they had ever attended. This wasn't about charity donations or social status. This was about the recognition of genuine heroism, the kind that came with the ultimate price. The transformation in the room was palpable, as people who had arrived expecting a routine ceremony found themselves face to face with the reality of sacrifice and service. Tyler Blackwood felt the weight of his earlier words crushing down on him like a physical force. He had called Jake Mason a nobody, a faceless soldier, someone who had gotten himself killed through carelessness. Now he was faced with the reality that Jake Mason had been everything Tyler pretended to be, a man who had made a real difference in the world, who had given his life for something greater than himself, who had earned the respect and gratitude of everyone who knew his story. As Cheryl held the Medal of Honor against her heart, the 8 Marines maintained their formation around her, creating a protective circle that spoke to their continued loyalty to their fallen brother. They had come to the ceremony not as guests, but as guardians, ensuring that Jake Mason's mother received the honor and respect she deserved. Their presence transformed the elegant ballroom into something resembling a sacred space, where the highest values of service and sacrifice were being recognized and celebrated. The atmosphere had changed completely from the beginning of the day. What had started as Tyler's carefully orchestrated social event had become something far more meaningful, a true ceremony of honor that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The crystal chandeliers that had once illuminated shallow conversations and social networking now cast their light on genuine emotion, real heroism, and the kind of recognition that money could never buy. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward one final time, his weathered features reflecting decades of service and the weight of having lost too many good soldiers. "Ma'am, your son didn't just save our lives that day. He saved our families, our futures, our children who will grow up with fathers because of his sacrifice. We are all here today, not just to honor Jake, but to honor you, the woman who raised a hero." The 8 Marines came to attention one final time, their salute creating a moment of perfect military precision in the elegant civilian setting. As they held their salute, every person in the room understood that they were witnessing something that transcended social class, political affiliation, or personal background. They were witnessing the recognition of the highest form of human courage and the deepest form of maternal sacrifice. And Tyler Blackwood realized that his wealth and influence meant nothing in the face of such authentic honor. The silence in the ballroom was broken by the sound of Tyler Blackwood's ragged breathing. He stood at the edge of the circle of Marines, his face pale and his hands trembling as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The man who entered the room as its most important benefactor now found himself facing the judgment of 8 warriors who had witnessed his casual cruelty toward a Gold Star mother. Master Sergeant Williams turned to face Tyler directly, his expression cold and unforgiving. "Sir, you have 30 seconds to explain to Mrs. Mason why you felt it was appropriate to insult her son's memory and destroy her invocation to witness his posthumous Medal of Honor ceremony." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced enemy fire and emerged stronger, and Tyler found himself unable to meet the Marine's gaze. I didn't know," Tyler stammered, his usual confidence completely shattered. "I thought she was just... she looked like..." He trailed off, realizing that any explanation would only make his actions seem more inexcusable. The truth was that he had made assumptions based on appearance and social class, and those assumptions had led him to commit an act of profound cruelty. "You thought she was just what?" demanded one of the younger Marines, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Just a poor woman who didn't deserve to be treated with basic human dignity? Just someone you could dismiss because she didn't fit your idea of what a military family should look like?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Tyler found himself without any answer that wouldn't condemn him further. Cheryl Mason, still clutching her son's Medal of Honor, looked up at Tyler with eyes that held no anger, only sadness. "My son died for you too," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room. "He died protecting the freedom of every person in this country, including the freedom for people like you to make money and live comfortable lives. He never asked what you looked like or how much money you had. He just did his duty." The words hit Tyler like physical blows, each one driving home the magnitude of his failure. He had spent his entire adult life believing that success was measured by material accumulation. But here was a woman who had lost everything that truly mattered and still possessed more dignity than he could ever hope to achieve. "Mrs. Mason," Tyler said, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees in front of her, "I am the most foolish man who ever lived. I insulted your son's memory. I destroyed your invitation. I treated you with contempt when you deserved nothing but honor and respect. I have no excuse for what I did, and I don't deserve your forgiveness." The words came out in a rush, driven by genuine remorse and the crushing realization of his own moral failure. The 8 Marines maintained their formation around Cheryl, their presence both protective and intimidating. They had seen too many of their brothers die in service to their country to tolerate any disrespect toward the families of the fallen. Tyler's wealth and influence meant nothing to them. They measured men by their character and their willingness to sacrifice for others, and by those standards, Tyler had been found wanting. Officer Kane and Brooke stood at the edge of the group, their own shame evident in their posture. "Ma'am, we failed in our duty today. We're supposed to serve and protect, but instead we served our own prejudices and tried to protect the wrong people. We're sorry, and we're going to make sure this never happens again." Captain Reed stepped forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Blackwood, your actions today have demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what honor means. You've shown contempt for sacrifice, disrespect for service, and cruelty toward a grieving mother. The question now is what you intend to do about it." Tyler remained on his knees, tears streaming down his face as he looked up at Cheryl. "Mrs. Mason, if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did today. I want to establish a foundation in Jake's name to help military families, to make sure that no Gold Star mother ever has to go through what you experienced today. I know it can't undo what I did, but maybe it can prevent it from happening to someone else." Cheryl reached out and placed her hand on Tyler's shoulder, her touch gentle, despite everything he had put her through. "Jake would want you to learn from this," she said softly. "He would want you to become a better person. That's what he died for, so that people could have the chance to be better than they were." Her forgiveness was complete and unconditional, but it came with a challenge that Tyler would carry for the rest of his life. The other guests in the room watched in stunned silence as Tyler slowly rose to his feet. Many of them had known him for years, had done business with him, had considered him a friend, but they had never seen him display genuine humility or remorse, and the transformation was both shocking and inspiring. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Reed announced, turning to address the full gathering, "we are here today to honor the memory of Sergeant Jake Mason, Medal of Honor recipient, and to recognize his mother, Mrs. Cheryl Mason. As a Gold Star mother who deserves our deepest respect and gratitude, I suggest we proceed with the ceremony that should have begun an hour ago." As if awakening from a dream, the crowd began to arrange itself for the formal ceremony. Tyler Blackwood took a seat in the back row, his head bowed in shame and contemplation. Officer Kane and Brooke stood at the exits, but their role had changed from excluding unwanted guests to ensuring that the ceremony proceeded with the dignity it deserved. And at the center of it all, Cheryl Mason stood surrounded by 8 Marines who had pledged their lives to honor her son's memory, preparing to receive the recognition that had been too long delayed. The formal ceremony began with a solemnity that seemed to transform the very air in the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, reverent glow over the assembled guests, who now sat in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a typical social event. Captain Reed had taken his position at the podium, his dress uniform a stark reminder of the military precision and honor that had brought them all together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Reed began, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony and tradition, "we gather today to honor the memory of Sergeant Jake Mason, a young man who embodied the highest ideals of military service and personal sacrifice. The Medal of Honor, which we present today, is awarded only to those who have displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their life, above and beyond the call of duty. Sergeant Mason's actions on that day in Afghanistan exemplified these qualities in their purest form. Gerald Mason stood at the front of the room, flanked by the 8 Marines who had become her honor guard. She had never felt smaller or more insignificant, yet paradoxically, she had never felt more important. These men, these warriors, had arranged themselves around her, not as protectors, but as equals, recognizing her as someone who had given as much to her country as they had. Her son's Medal of Honor box rested in her hands, its weight seeming to grow with each passing moment. Sergeant Mason's final act of heroism saved 12 lives, Captain Reed continued, his words carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom. He drew enemy fire away from his trapped comrades, providing them with the cover they needed to escape to safety. He knew that his actions would likely cost him his life, but he chose to act anyway, placing the lives of his brothers above his own safety. This is the definition of heroism in its purest form. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his weathered features reflecting decades of service and sacrifice. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Cheryl directly, "your son's courage didn't begin on that battlefield in Afghanistan. It began with the values you instilled in him, the strength you gave him, and the example you set through your own sacrifices. You worked multiple jobs to support his education. You sold your home to help fund his military service, and you did it all without complaint or expectation of recognition. You are as much a hero as your son was." The 8 Marines came to attention simultaneously, their movements so synchronized it seemed choreographed. As one, they rendered a perfect salute, holding it for a long, reverent moment before slowly lowering their hands. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. It was a recognition of Cheryl's status as a Gold Star mother, a woman who had given her child to the service of her country. "Mrs. Mason," Captain Reed said, opening a larger presentation case, "on behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, I present to you the Medal of Honor awarded posthumously to your son, Sergeant Jake Mason." He lifted the medal from its case, the blue ribbon and star-shaped medallion catching the light from the chandeliers, and placed it carefully around Cheryl's neck. The weight of the medal seemed to anchor Cheryl to the moment, making everything real in a way that her son's death had never quite been. She pressed the medal against her heart, and for a moment she could almost feel Jake's presence beside her, his young face bright with the smile she remembered from his childhood. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I'm so proud of you, my brave boy." The entire room rose to its feet, applauding with a reverence that transcended mere appreciation. These were people who had come to a social event expecting to see a ceremonial presentation, but instead they had witnessed something that would change them forever. They had seen real heroism honored, real sacrifice recognized, and real dignity restored to someone who had been wrong. Tyler Blackwood remained seated in the back row, his head still bowed in shame and contemplation. The applause washed over him like a wave, but he felt separate from it, unworthy to participate in the recognition of heroism after his own display of cowardice and cruelty. But as the applause died down, he felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Cheryl Mason standing beside him. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, her voice carrying only kindness, "Jake died so that people could have the chance to be better tomorrow than they were today. Don't waste that chance." She turned and began walking toward the exit, the 8 Marines falling into formation around her, creating an honor guard that would escort her from the building. As Cheryl moved through the crowd, every person she passed stepped aside respectfully, creating a path for her passage. The same people who had watched her being humiliated just hours earlier now recognized her for what she truly was, a woman who had given everything to her country and asked for nothing in return except the chance to honor her son's memory. The ballroom doors opened, and Cheryl stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. Still wearing her son's Medal of Honor, the 8 Marines followed her, their formation perfect and their purpose clear. They would ensure that she reached her destination safely, and they would carry Jake Mason's memory with them for the rest of their lives. 1 year later, Cheryl Mason stood at a different podium in a very different setting. The auditorium of Lincoln High School in rural Alabama was a far cry from the crystal chandeliers and marble floors of the Riverside Convention Center, but the respect in the room was just as profound. She was here for the opening ceremony of the Jake Mason Scholarship Fund, a program that would provide educational opportunities for the children of military families who had lost parents in service to their country. "We don't have much," Cheryl said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium filled with students, parents, and community members. "But I have my son's promise, and now that promise will help other children take their next steps forward." The audience erupted in applause as Cheryl carefully lifted Jake's Medal of Honor from around her neck and placed it in a specially designed display case that would be permanently mounted in the school's main hallway. Standing beside her was a 14-year-old boy named Marcus, the son of one of the Marines that Jake had saved. Marcus had been chosen as the first recipient of the scholarship, and his presence created a living connection between Jake's sacrifice and the future it had made possible. "Your son didn't just save my dad," Marcus said, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "He saved our whole family. Now I get to go to college because of him." In the back of the auditorium, barely visible through the partially open doors, Tyler Blackwood stood watching the ceremony on a small monitor that had been set up for overflow seating. He didn't speak, didn't make his presence known, but simply observed as the woman he had once scorned continued to transform her grief into something that would benefit others for generations to come. In his hand was another check, already signed, that would fund the scholarship program for the next academic year. His transformation was ongoing, measured not in grand gestures, but in quiet, consistent acts of support that honored the memory of a hero he had once dismissed. 6 months later, the Jake Mason Foundation had been established with Tyler Blackwood's fortune as its primary funding source. The foundation provided support for military families, education assistance for the children of fallen soldiers, and housing assistance for Gold Star mothers. Tyler himself had become a different man, his perspective permanently altered by his encounter with genuine heroism and sacrifice. Officer Kane and Brooks had both requested transfers to community policing positions, where they worked to build bridges between law enforcement and the communities they served. They carried with them the memory of their failure on that day, using it as a reminder to treat every person they encountered with dignity and respect. And Cheryl Mason had become a speaker at military events across the country, sharing Jake's story and reminding audiences that heroism comes in many forms, that sacrifice is often invisible, and that the greatest honors in life are earned through service to others rather than service to oneself. The Medal of Honor that hung around her neck was more than a decoration. It was a symbol of the love between a mother and her son, a testament to the courage that ordinary people can display in extraordinary circumstances, and a reminder that real wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the differences we make. Sometimes, the